Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to WCPT. We are so excited to chat with our next guest, Roland Paris. Roland is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and a former senior advisor on foreign policy to the outgoing Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. On a more personal note, Roland was a thesis advisor for Phil and I years ago when we were doing our doctoral work at the University of Colorado. And we should point out many, many, many years ago. Welcome, Roland. It's so nice to have a chance to talk with you. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Bill. It's terrific to be with you.
So maybe we should start with the stupid questions, and then we'll get those out of the way. Donald Trump, the president of the United States, has developed this, what we call a juvenile affinity for suggesting that Canada should simply join the United States as the 51st state, and also for referring to the Canadian Prime Minister as governor. Can you talk to us about the reactions this has caused in Canada, both maybe your own reactions as well as those in the government and public more broadly?
Well, it's bizarre to start with, and I think that the Canadian public initially was puzzled by the fact that Trump started talking about Trudeau as a governor and Canada as the 51st state. At the official level, what you saw were Canadian leaders basically trying to congratulate Trump on such an amusing joke and reassuring people here that this was a joke. But when Trump continued to repeat it, and it was clear that he was not joking, then attitude shifted. And I think that what's transparent is that this is an attempt to intimidate. It's insulting. It is strangely amusing and alarming at the same time, because this is all coming along with his threat to impose a 25% tariff on imports from Canada, which would be absolutely devastating for the Canadian economy, because 76% of our exports go to the United States, because the supply chains are absolutely integrated crisscrossing the border, and it's a huge percentage of our GDP. So I think that the concern right now is that he might actually carry out these threats, although he's said a lot of things in the past that he didn't actually do, and maybe that's the faint hope clause here.
Yeah. Hi, Roland. It's good to hear from you.
Hi, Phil.
I think the thing that maybe I'll just ask you this before I'll sort of expand it a little bit. Like, what do you have, as a political scientist or even as a, former advisor, like what's your explanation for why Trump is doing this? Is it just, again, silliness? Is it ego? Like, what's his motivation here?
Yeah, it's really hard to get inside his head. But for one thing, there's a general point, which is that he does try to throw his negotiating partners off balance. This is what he's always done from back when he was a real estate mogul. And that's what he's doing here. He's doing it with Denmark. Over Greenland. He's doing it when he gave a speech yesterday virtually at the World Economic Forum, saying that all NATO countries have to spend 5% of their equivalent of GDP on defense. The United States currently spends 3.38%. Like this is like heroically, wildly ambitious. So, there's part of this is that he sets out these kind of wild starting points for discussions. But I think there's something deeper here. And the deeper thing is his connection in his State of the Union address. You heard him give a big shout out to William McKinley. And there is an expansionist quality to Trump's thinking that's coming through when he talks about Greenland, when he talks about Panama, when he talks about Canada, when he talks about the United States expanding. And, this is what is really striking to me as a political scientist, is hearing a kind of logic of manifest destiny and American expansionism that we haven't heard in a very long time, none of our lifetimes.
Yeah, so let me ask a follow up on that, because I was thinking about this a lot this week, because you're the person who taught me about norms, right? Like, I learned about this from you. And the stuff that Trump is saying is, I think for an American audience, it's easy just to chalk it up as, this is stupid, but they're also really serious. And the thing that I thought about a lot was about how Trump's rhetoric is really kind of shaping global attitudes. And I think of, China and Russia, and how this talk of, if we want, or if it's important to the United States, we can take Greenland, or it feels like a gift to those other countries. Can you talk a little bit about that, or how you perceive that, or what's the impact the way he's talking about has on the broader global community?
It's a great question. First, let me just say something about whether this is serious, and then let me answer your question directly about the reverberations more broadly. Yeah, this is serious. Trump's comments on Canada are already having a measurable effect on our economy. It is chilling investment already. And the Canadian government has prepared and is prepared to launch a very significant counter-retaliatory tariffs on American imports into Canada if Trump goes ahead with his tariff threat. Now, the United States is so much bigger than Canada, that nobody wants to be in a tariff fight with the United States. But I think what many Americans don't recognize is that Canada's a bigger customer for American exports than China, Japan, Britain, and France combined, that the United States gets more than 50% of the oil that it imports from Canada, natural gas, electricity, critical minerals, for high tech. And, this could be very costly on both sides of the border, and I hope that cooler heads prevail. Mm-hmm. It's serious. So in terms of the larger implications here, coming back to this idea of the United States, of Trump's vision of the United States effectively having a kind of free hand to demand that weaker countries within its immediate surroundings comply with his wishes, even hand over territory in the case of Greenland. This is very consistent with a kind of spheres of influence logic of rights and obligations in international affairs. Now, the dominant logic in international affairs, the dominant norm is that of sovereignty, which is territorial integrity and political independence. And that's why it was so shocking to us to see Vladimir Putin, wantonly and brazenly invade a neighboring country and claim that he had a right to invade that country, that it wasn't really a country if you think about it. And it's shocking to us to see what China has been doing in the South and East China Sea, claiming all of this space as China's own, and basically saying, try us. We dare you. Well, this logic that Trump is describing, or at least communicating with regard to Canada and Panama and Greenland, is really consistent with that kind of spheres of influence logic. And it, I think, creates a very easy opportunity for emboldened authoritarians elsewhere basically to say, listen, the United States, leader of the free world. Now I would put that in quotation marks, by the way. Right. The United States itself is demonstrating that these norms have changed.
Oh, that's significant. Yeah. Roland, we chatted with you during the Trump's first term about how the international community can and should respond to American leadership or the lack thereof under Trump. A lot has changed since then, both in the United States and internationally. But we were curious to hear what your thoughts are now on how you think the international community should respond to American leadership, this new approach.
Well, the strategies in Trump 1 might not work in Trump 2, but in Trump 1, the most successful strategies involved a couple of things. One was really expanding contacts and networks with American influencers, if I can use that term, at all levels of the U.S. political system, in Washington, at the state level, at the local level, in industry, in labor, and mobilizing those networks around very specific issues that were important to Canada or important to other countries that were engaging with the first Trump administration. And the second part involved a kind of jujitsu where there was an attempt not to directly confront Trump, but to basically say, yeah, okay, we hear what you're saying, but let's talk about it. Let's figure something out. Perfect example was the renegotiation of the NAFTA and its transformation into what's called the USMCA in the United States. And essentially what happened was all of those two strategies were put into effect, and we ended up with something that was very similar to the original NAFTA, where really important core interests of Canada were preserved. But Trump, in the end, was able to say that this was the NAFTA had been the worst trade deal in the history of the earth, and the USMCA was his baby. It was the best. Now, that was the strategy the first time around. Trump, I'm expecting, we're already seeing, is much more unleashed this time. He knows this is his last time in office. He's learned the levers of power. He's gotten rid of people. He's not appointing people who might resist him. He's getting rid of people in the bureaucracy who could be potential obstacles. He's already stacked the Supreme Court, which, in spite of all the attempts to hold Trump to account for his various actions, actually resulted in a decision which immunizes Trump from most possible prosecution. Yeah. And he controls both houses. Have to be ready to push back very hard. And I think that that's what the European Union is going to be ready to do, too.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry about that. We just had we went to break just a little bit too early. That was my mistake. So we are talking with Roland Paris. We're going to take a quick break now, and then we will be right back in just a second.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster William Muck.
Welcome back to WCPT. We are chatting with Dr. Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa, and we've been thinking about the role of the Trump administration, both in Canada, internationally. Phil, you were going to ask another question here.
Well, just as a follow-up, you have served as an advisor to the Prime Minister. So just to make it sort of concrete, like if you were advising the Prime Minister today, how do you advise him? Like, what are the concrete things you recommend in responding to someone like Trump, a bully in the international system?
Yeah, well, there are a few things, and the government is essentially already doing these things. First of all, Trump initially indicated to Justin Trudeau when they met at Mar-a-Lago that he was really concerned about the flow of people over the Canadian border in the United States and the flow of drugs, in particular fentanyl. So the Canadian government came back and within the space of a couple of weeks announced a major new program to expand border security and also to deal with the fentanyl traffic. Now, I should say that it is tiny by comparison with the equivalent of the U.S. southern border. But the idea here was, first and foremost, okay, he has a concern about border security. It doesn't hurt us to strengthen border security. It helps us. We care about fentanyl, too. We'll do more on that. That's number one. Number two, redoubling efforts to make contact with people who are in the incoming elements of the new administration, people who have the ear of people who are coming into the new administration, and partners right across the U.S. political system. So this is a vital network to be able to activate when stuff happens and to avoid problems from occurring. Thirdly, preparing for all different scenarios, and that's what the Canadian government has been doing, including the possibility of the 25% tariff on Canadian imports in the United States, which, viewed from this side of the Canada-U.S. border, is a nuclear decision by Donald Trump. So there's a kind of mix and match combination of strategies that are available, and the Canadian government will almost certainly match dollar for dollar any tariffs, and will have in its back pocket more serious things that it could do. But of course, everybody here is aware that getting into a knife fight with Donald Trump when the U.S. economy is 10 times as big as the Canadian economy probably isn't going to be successful in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Roland, Canada is set to have elections in the coming months, and Prime Minister Trudeau, who you worked with closely, recently announced his decision to step down as the leader of the Liberal Party. Can you talk a bit about what led to such a significant shift in support for Trudeau over the past couple of years?
So, Justin Trudeau is now, it's pretty close to 10 years that he's been in office. It's certainly, he's in his 10th year. And about 18 months ago or so, the public opinion polls really decisively shifted against him. And why? A whole bunch of reasons, but the most important one is time. So governments tend to last up to about 10 years in this country. There is, in democracies, the very welcome practice of throw the bums out. It's the escape valve that democracy always has, and people were very clearly tired of him. But he was also, suffered from the same challenges that many incumbents did who were in power during the pandemic. All of the disruptions and all of the irritations and all of the frustrations and all of the social ills, including the subsequent inflation and cost of living challenges and housing problems, et cetera, they all quite appropriately fell on his doorstep, and he just couldn't survive that.
So despite all of that, I mean, so it looks like, who knows? We're not predicting the future, but the Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, am I pronouncing that proproperly?
Yeah, that's right.
Appears to be, he's likely to be the next prime minister. And people have accused him of being a soft populist. But I guess one of my things that I think about as a sort of comparativist who I look out at things is, despite all that stuff that you just mentioned, inflation and all these other things, Canada seems to, have had a healthier immune system in their resistance to what has happened much, in many places around the world, which is the rise of populism and whatnot. Like, when you look at it, what do you think? What has made the difference between the American, tendency to succumb to this populist rhetoric versus Canada's ability to kind of withstand it?
Yeah, one thing that's important to note here is that, and I think that it's visible around the world, is when we're talking about the impact of Trump's behavior on international norms, it's not just the norms of how countries interact with each other. It's also kind of norms and habits and practices and customs about how politicians behave. And this kind of contagion effect that's described in the political science literature is very much visible in terms of Trump's style of leadership, and we see that being replicated everywhere. Now, Pierre Poilievre is no Donald Trump. Right. And even though Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition Conservative Party, who's 24 points ahead in the polls right now and who would win if there were an election today, even though he's picked up the kind of language of the culture wars from the United States. He sat down recently, interviewed with the now Canadian expat Jordan Peterson and railed about wokeism and the usual assortment of things. He is constrained in a way by the political structures of Canada. There's a political culture dimension to this, but there's also an institutional effect. The political culture and political cultures can break down, and we're seeing that happen to some extent in Canada. The political culture is the expectation of how politicians are supposed to behave, and that expectation is embedded, and it's mainly embedded in the minds of voters. And anyone who was behaving as rudely as Trump is behaving would very much still violate essential political norms in this country that are embedded in the minds of voters. But those norms are being eroded by just seeing this happen right across the border. But I think that, Pierre Poilievre will see the institutional dimensions are that in order to govern this country, you really do effectively have to maintain a coalition. And there are elements in the Canadian public, regionally concentrated, that are more Trumpy than others, but you really can't govern in this country without very strong support from the areas around either in Ontario, around Toronto, or in Quebec, and they tend to be more moderate voters. So if they have to be part of a winning coalition, a governing coalition, then that also has a moderating effect.
We would love to get your take on what you see as you look out at the international system right now. I mean, there's some conversation that we may be...
I can't say that on the radio, I don't think.
The edited version, maybe. Because, some people talk about that we may be entering the most dangerous international moment since the end of the Cold War, war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, rising tensions between the United States and China. How do you assess this, or what do you see when you look out at the world? And, fewer profanities is probably the better.
Yeah, I'll try to maintain the norms of our own conversation.
Yes.
And I'm happy to do so. Listen, the world is clearly becoming more dangerous. We everyone of a certain age has lived through a period of extraordinary stability in international affairs. And I'm talking about the period right after the end of the Cold War. And we look back on those days and maybe kind of smile at how naive people felt or were expressing themselves, or we ourselves felt about the direction of the world. But we're not in Kansas anymore. That is definitely changed. And so part of the challenge here is, relative to what? The world is dangerous now relative to what? It is certainly more dangerous than it was, a decade ago or 2 decades ago. What is the prospect of major power war right now? I'm talking about United States, Russia, China. Growing, but not imminent. But we're living through, I think, to pick up some of the political science literature too, we're living through a period of power transition. And the power transition is from a period of American unipolar dominance to something else. Some people call it multipolar. Some people think it would basically be defined by a kind of U.S.-China arrangement. Other people see much more complicated arrangements. Whatever it is, we're living through this power transition. And we know from previous power transitions that they tend to be the most unstable times and the highest likelihood of war. And that navigating those periods requires a considerable amount of maturity from the leaders of the most powerful countries in order to keep guardrails in place and to minimize the risk of escalation, and to recognize that, all of these countries have some portion of responsibility to sustain, the relative stability of the system as a whole. Even during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union really practiced a sense of, it's hard to imagine and it's hard to identify, but there was an element of responsibility there in terms of the guardrails that they established, avoiding direct contact between their forces and many other norms that were established. I don't see that kind of maturity in the leaders today. And so you put the power transition together with this recklessness. I see growing recklessness. That's what gets me really worried. It's the recklessness combined with the, underlying shifts that would be a challenge to manage under any circumstances.
Do you feel you got one more question here?
Well, I mean, I have it's a big question, though, so I don't know if we have time to, I don't know how much time we have.
Sure, we got some time, yeah.
So, I mean, I tend to, I think Bill would agree, and I feel pretty confident you do, that like the international order, the international systems, they've been pretty good to us. So, as they are under challenge and as we don't have particularly mature leaders, like, what for those of us who want to see, an expansion instead of a collapse of things like international law and human rights and all of these things, how does the international community do that? Are we just at the mercy of the Donald Trumps of the world?
I was having a conversation with my wife last night, somewhat dark, and we try and keep each other buoyed up. At least in her work, she deals with things that can be sometimes a little bit dark. In my work, in our work, we also deal with these challenges. And, I used to say, honey, things could be worse. Donald Trump could still be the president of the United States. So I've now replaced that. I think I said last night, sweetheart, just look on the bright side. This reckless, hostile, dangerous person, president of the United States, has 3 years and 362 days left in his term.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up, Roland. So we are so thankful for your time and insight. As a reminder to the audience, we've been talking with Roland Paris, who is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Thank you so much, Roland. We've really appreciated it. It's so great to catch up.
It's terrific talking to both of you guys, too. Thank you for having me.